I still remember the sound of his laughter. Not the kind from when he was 7, chasing fireflies in the backyard with his sister, their giggles like wind chimes on a summer evening. No, this was different. This laughter had edges. It cut through the dinner table like a cold blade, sharp and deliberate, and it stays with me even now, months later. When I sit alone in my kitchen with a cup of tea that's gone cold between my hands. The kitchen where I taught him to crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl. The kitchen where he used to do his homework while I cooked, asking me questions about fractions and spelling words. That kitchen. So I thought. It was a Sunday. I remember because I'd made pot roast, his favorite since he was a boy. The smell of it filled the house all afternoon, rich and warm, the kind of smell that used to bring him running down the stairs before I even called. But he's 43 now, and he doesn't run anymore. He walks with the weight of a man who believes the world owes him something, and that Sunday, he walked into my home with his wife, Vanessa, and their 2 teenagers who barely looked up from their phones long enough to say hello to their grandmother. I didn't mind. I was just happy to have them there. It had been almost 2 months since the last visit, and before that even longer. I'd stopped counting the weeks between phone calls. We sat around the table, the same oak table my late husband Walter and I bought 47 years ago from an estate sale in town. Walter refinished it himself, spent 3 weekends in the garage sanding and staining until his hands were raw. I ran my fingers along the edge of it while they ate, feeling the grooves and imperfections. The small burn mark from when my daughter accidentally set a hot pan down without a trivet. She was 12. She cried for an hour, afraid I'd be angry. I held her and told her it just gave the table character, a story. Everything has a story if you look close enough. My son, Daniel, was talking about his job, something about a promotion he didn't get, less qualified who got it instead. Vanessa nodded along, scrolling through her phone between bites. The kids were silent, existing in their own glowing rectangles of light. I watched them and felt something hollow open up inside my chest, but I pushed it down. I asked Daniel about the promotion, tried to sound interested, supportive, the way mothers do. He shrugged, said it didn't matter, that he'd probably start looking for something else soon anyway. Then he looked around the dining room, his eyes moving slowly across the walls, the old china cabinet, the framed photos, and he said something that made my heart stop. He said, "You know, Mom, this place is worth a fortune now. You have any idea what houses in this neighborhood are going for?" I smiled, uncertain where this was going, and said something about how the area had changed, how when Walter and I first moved in, it was just young families and empty lots. He nodded, but he wasn't really listening. He leaned back in his chair, that chair that Walter used to sit in, and he said, "Vanessa and I have been talking. We think it's time you considered moving somewhere smaller, easier to manage. One of those nice senior communities, you know. They have activities, people your age. You'd probably be happier." The pot roast suddenly tasted like chalk in my mouth. I set down my fork carefully, the way you do when you're trying to steady yourself, and I said, "I'm not going anywhere, Daniel. This is my home." That's when he laughed. That terrible sharp laugh. He looked at Vanessa, and she looked at him, and they shared something between them, some private joke I wasn't part of. "Mom," he said, and his voice had changed, become patient in that condescending way people use when they think you're too old or too stupid to understand. "You don't really have a choice here. The house is falling apart, the roof needs work, the plumbing is ancient, the foundation probably has issues. You can't keep up with it. And honestly, it's not like you'll be around forever to enjoy it. We need to think practically." I felt my hands begin to shake, so I pressed them flat against the table. "This house is mine," I said quietly. "Your father and I bought it. We raised you here. I'm not leaving." Daniel sighed, the kind of sigh that said he'd expected this, that he'd prepared for my stubbornness. "Actually, Mom," he said, leaning forward now, his elbows on Walter's table, "I've been looking into it. You put my name on the deed 7 years ago, remember? When Dad was sick and you were worried about estate stuff. You and me were both on the title. That means I have just as much say as you do about what happens to this place." The room went silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall, The one Walter's mother gave us as a wedding present. Tick, tick, tick. Each second felt like a small explosion in my chest. I did remember. I remembered sitting in the lawyer's office, Walter barely able to hold a pen, his hands shaking from the medication. The lawyer had suggested it, said it would make things easier when the time came, would help avoid probate, keep things simple for the kids. Daniel had been so helpful then, driving us to appointments, handling paperwork. I'd been grateful. I'd been drowning in medical bills and fear and exhaustion, and he'd seemed like a lifeline. That doesn't mean you can force me out of my own home, I said, and I hated how weak my voice sounded, how it trembled at the edges. He smiled then, not unkindly, but not warmly either. It was the smile of someone who'd already won. I'm not forcing you, Mom. I'm helping you see reason. You're 78 years old. Living alone in a house this size isn't safe. What if you fall? What if something happens and no one's here? We're just thinking about what's best for you. What's best for me? As if I were a child. As if 7 decades of life had taught me nothing what I needed, what I wanted. I looked at Vanessa, hoping for some support, some feminine understanding, but she just smiled sympathetically and said, "It really is for the best, Mom." She called me Mom, but it sounded hollow, a formality. I looked at my grandchildren, but they weren't even listening, lost in their screens. This conversation as relevant to them as background noise. I said I'm not leaving. I repeated, and this time my voice was stronger. Daniel's smile faded. "We'll see about that," he said quietly, and then he changed the subject, started talking about their vacation plans for the summer, somewhere tropical, expensive. I stopped listening. I finished my dinner in silence while my mind raced, trying to understand what had just happened. Trying to figure out when my son had become this stranger sitting in his father's chair, plotting to take away the only thing I had left that truly mattered. They left an hour later. Daniel kissed my cheek on the way out, told me to think about what he'd said, really think about it. I closed the door behind them and stood in the hallway. The same hallway where I'd measured his height every birthday, pencil marks climbing the doorframe like a ladder to nowhere. I touched those marks with my fingertips and I cried. I cried for the little boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street, who used to bring me dandelions he'd picked from the yard, who used to tell me I was the best mom in the whole world. I cried for Walter, who should have been here, who would have known what to do. And then I stopped crying, dried my eyes, and I started to think. The next morning I called my daughter Rebecca. She lives 3 states away, has her own family, her own busy life, but she's always been the one who calls on my birthday, who sends cards for no reason, who actually listens when I talk. I told her about the dinner, about what Daniel had said. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Mom, I need to tell you something. Daniel called me last month. He wanted to I'd agree to putting you in a home, said it was for your own good. He wanted me to help convince you." My blood ran cold. "And what did you say?" I asked, barely breathing. I told him he was out of his mind. I told him that house is yours, and you can live there until you're 110 if you want to. Then I told him if he ever suggested it again, he'd have to deal with me. I could hear the anger in her voice, protective and fierce, and it warmed something inside me that had gone very, very cold. Over the next few weeks things escalated. Daniel started showing up unannounced, always with papers in his hand, information about senior living facilities, price estimates for house repairs that seemed impossibly high, articles about elderly people who'd fallen and died alone in their homes. He'd leave them on the kitchen counter like little threats, little reminders that he was serious. He brought a realtor by once, didn't even ask, just showed up with a woman in a sharp suit, who walked through my home with a measuring tape and a clipboard, making notes, talking about staging and curb appeal, while I stood there in shock. When I asked her to leave, Daniel told me I was being unreasonable, that he was only trying to help me prepare for the inevitable. The inevitable. As if my life was already over. As if I was already dead. Then came the phone calls from his lawyer, not Daniel himself anymore, but a lawyer, telling me that Daniel was prepared to take legal action if necessary, that as co-owner of the property he had rights, that a judge might agree that I was no longer capable of living independently. The word, incompetent, was used. I sat on my bed after that call, Walter's side still empty after all these years, and I felt something inside me break, and then harden into something else, something sharp. I called my own lawyer the next day. His name was Morton Hughes, and he'd handled Walter's estate, knew our family history. I told him everything. He listened quietly, and when I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Patterson, I need to look at something. Can you bring in all the paperwork from when you added Daniel's name to the deed?" I told him I would. I spent that evening digging through file cabinets, finding the documents, the memories of that terrible year coming back with each page. Walter's diagnosis, the treatments that didn't work, the conversations about making sure I'd be taken care of, making sure the kids would be okay. I brought everything to Martin's office the next morning. He spread the papers across his desk, put on his reading glasses, and went through them line by line. I watched his face change as he read, watched something like satisfaction cross his features. Finally, he looked up at me and smiled. "Mrs. Patterson, your son seems to have forgotten something very important." My heart started beating faster. "What's that?" I asked. Martin tapped the deed with his finger. "When you added Daniel's name to the property, the language specifies that's added as a joint tenant with rights of survivorship, but with a very specific clause. Do you remember your husband insisting on adding something? Right here." He pointed to a paragraph I'd never really understood, legal language that had seemed unimportant at the time. I leaned forward, squinting at the words. Martin explained, "This clause states that while Daniel is on the deed, any decision regarding the sale, transfer, or use of the property requires unanimous consent from all parties. But more importantly, there's a revocability provision here. At any time, for any reason, you can remove him from the deed." Walter made sure of it. He told me at the time that he wanted to make things easier for you, but he didn't want to give up your control. He said. And I remember this exactly. My wife is sharper than most people half her age, and this is her home. I'm not taking that away from her, even to help our son. I felt tears burning in my eyes, but this time they weren't from sadness. Walter had known. Even sick, even dying, he'd known to protect me. He'd known what mattered. "Can I do it now?" I asked. "Can I take his name off?" Martin nodded. "We'll need to file the paperwork, go through the proper channels, but yes, it's your absolute right. And Mrs. Patterson, once it's done, the house is solely yours again. Your son will have no legal claim whatsoever." I sat back in my chair, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. "Let's do it," I said. "Let's do it today." The paperwork took 3 weeks to process. 3 weeks during which Daniel continued his campaign, growing more aggressive, more certain. He started making plans without consulting me, told me he'd found a facility with an opening in 2 months, that I needed to start packing, that he'd hired someone to come clean out the house. He walked through the rooms pointing at furniture, saying things like, "We'll keep this, sell that, donate those," as if it was already his, as if it was already gone. I let him talk. I nodded. I said nothing. Inside, I was counting down the days. The paperwork was finalized on a Tuesday. Martin called me to confirm everything was recorded with the county, everything was legal and binding. Daniel's name had been removed from the deed. The house was mine, completely, solely, unquestionably mine. I thanked Martin, hung up the phone, and then I called Daniel. I told him I needed to talk to him, that he should come by that evening. He sounded pleased, probably thought I was ready to surrender. He said he'd be there at 6. He arrived exactly on time, Vanessa with him, both of them wearing expressions of practiced sympathy. We sat in the living room, not the kitchen this time. I wanted to be formal. They settled onto the couch, and Daniel leaned forward with his hands clasped, ready to be understanding, ready to hear me admit defeat. "So, Mom," he said gently, "have you had time to think about what we discussed? About making this transition easier for everyone?" I looked at him, this man who had my eyes and Walter's jawline, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. "I have thought about it," I said. "I've thought about it a great deal, and I've made some decisions." He smiled, relieved. "That's great, Mom. Really great. We can start looking at facilities this week, and I've already talked to a few estate sale companies about." I held up my hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "You misunderstand me, Daniel," I'm not going anywhere. But I have made a decision about the house. His smile faltered slightly. What do you mean? He asked. I pulled out the envelope I'd been keeping in my lap, the one Martin had sent over with all the final documentation. I handed it to him. This is a copy of the new deed. I had your name removed. The house is solely in my name now. As it should have been all along. I watched the color drain from his face as he opened the envelope, as his eyes scanned the papers. Vanessa leaned over to look, her expression changing from confusion to shock. Daniel said finally, his voice tight, "We had an agreement. I'm on the deed. I have rights." I shook my head slowly. "You have rights. Past tense. And we never had an agreement, Daniel. Your father and I made a decision to add your name to make things easier when the time came. But that time isn't now, and your father, bless him, was wise enough to make sure I could change my mind if I needed to, and I needed to." He stood up, the papers crumpling in his hand. "This is insane. You can't manage this house on your own. You're being stubborn and irrational." I stood up too, slower, older, but no less firm. "What I'm being, Daniel, is clear-headed. I know exactly what I'm doing. You decided that because I'm elderly, I must be incompetent. You decided that my home, my life, my choices were yours to make. You brought lawyers and realtors into my house without permission. You spoke to me like I was a child. You forgot that I'm your mother, but more than that. You forgot that I'm a person with my own mind and my own rights." Vanessa stood now too, putting a hand on Daniel's arm. "You're making a mistake," she said to me, her voice cold. "What happens when you do fall? When something happens and you're alone here?" I looked at her directly. "Then I'll handle it. The same way I've handled everything else in my 78 years. But let me be very clear about something. This is my house, mine, and neither of you will ever have any claim to it. I've also revised my will. When I die, and it will be on my own terms in my own time, this house goes to Rebecca, who actually loves me and not what she can get from me." Daniel's face went red, anger and humiliation warring across his features. "You can't do this," he repeated, but it sounded hollow now, desperate. "I already did," I said quietly. "And now I'm going to ask you to leave. Both of you." We stood there for a long moment, the three of us, and I could see him trying to figure out if there was anything left to say, any argument left to make. But there wasn't. The law was clear. The house was mine. He'd gambled on my vulnerability and lost. They left without another word. I watched from the window as they got into their car, watched Daniel slam his door hard enough to make the car shake. I watched them drive away, and then I locked my door, something I'd rarely done before, and I walked through my house room by room. I touched the walls Walter had painted. I straightened the pictures of my children when they were young and innocent and kind. I sat at my kitchen table and I cried. But these tears were different. These were tears of grief for what I'd lost, yes, but also tears of relief, of strength reclaimed, of a battle won. The months that followed were quiet. Daniel didn't call, didn't visit. Rebecca said he was telling people I'd gone senile, that I'd been manipulated by my lawyer, that I was making a mistake I'd regret. But I didn't regret it, not for a moment. My daughter visited twice, brought her kids, filled my home with the kind of laughter I'd been missing. Real laughter, warm laughter. She helped me with some repairs, hired people to fix the roof and update the plumbing, all on my dime, all with my permission. She treated me like an adult capable of making decisions, and that simple respect meant more than she could ever know. I heard through a mutual friend that Daniel had counted on inheriting this house. That he'd even taken out loans against his expectation of that inheritance, that he was in some financial trouble. I felt a pang of sadness for that, for the choices he'd made, but I didn't feel responsible. He was a grown man who'd made his own decisions, and the consequences of those decisions were his to bear, not mine. Sometimes I sit in my living room in the evening, in the chair that used to be Walter's, and I think about what that word, home, really means. It's not just walls and a roof and rooms full of furniture. It's the place where you're allowed to be yourself, where you have control over your own life, where you're not just a problem to be solved or an asset to be managed. It's dignity. It's autonomy. It's the simple, fundamental right to say, this is mine, and I get to decide. My son laughed when I said I still owned the house. as if my ownership was a coin delusion, an old woman's confusion. He thought he'd already won, thought he'd already taken what was mine. But what he forgot, what he never truly understood, is that I've been making decisions and standing my ground since before he was born. I raised him. I raised 2 children, buried a husband, survived losses and hardships he can't imagine. I am not fragile just because I'm old. I am not powerless just because I'm alone. The house is still mine. I wake up here every morning, make my tea in my kitchen, tend to my garden that Walter planted 40 years ago. I am not in some facility with scheduled activities and people my own age. I am here, in my home, living my life on my terms, and I will stay here until I decide otherwise, and that decision will be mine and mine alone. And every time I walk through these rooms, I think of that laugh, that sharp, dismissive laugh. And I smile because I know something my son learned too late. The greatest mistake you can make is underestimating someone who has nothing left to prove, and everything left to protect.